me get that started, and we are rolling. Elizabeth, stand by.
Santa Barbara's Treasure Sleuth will help you put a value on the treasures in your own home.
Every time it rains, pennies from heaven. Don't you know each cloud contains pennies from heaven?
So let's find out. How valuable is it?
2, 1, you are live.
Hello, Santa Barbara. It's your chantress of everything valuable and beautiful, Elizabeth Stewart. And I have to say, this is a little bit different for me, but extremely interesting. Email came in that there was going to be a lecture. The Santa Barbara Trust for Historical Preservation and UCSB History Associates got together for a special evening lecture with UCSB, will get together, I should say, with UCSB Professor Veronica Castillo Munoz. And the topic is the Mexican Revolution and a really interesting slant on it. And I thought, this is so interesting. I got in touch with the trust, and they led me to the head of the History Associates, who got in touch with Veronica Castillo Munoz, and she's with us today to talk about her work. And I just found it, gosh, you guys, yesterday I just was so enthralled getting into this period of history. And I have a special introduction, by the way, but I want to let you know who Veronica is. She's an associate professor in the Department of History at UCSB. She's written widely in Spanish and English on the intersection between gender, family migration, and the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. She's the author of The Other California, Land, Identity, and Politics on the Mexican Borderlands. That's published by the University of California Press in 2017. Recently, she collaborated on a bi-national exhibit of Pancho Villa with the National Museum of the Mexican Revolution in Mexico City. And she's working currently on a new book project. We were talking a little bit before we went on the air, her stories of the Mexican Revolution, which examines border women's experiences with war and exile between 1910 and 1920. She's a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of the American Historians. And so I want to start by saying, I want to set the scene a little bit. Then there is a museum called the National Museum of the Revolution, and it's a monument to the Mexican Revolution. And it's in the Plaza de la República, Mexico City. Now, the monument is pretty impressive. So if you're interested and you're sitting by your computer, maybe take a look at it. It's pretty interesting. It was constructed as the legislative palace for the Mexican government at a certain point in history in the early 20th century. And the unfinished architectural work, it sat there for a while, and it was begun as a dome of the palace for the Mexican federal legislature, and the project languished after 1913. Well, 20 years later, the work began to turn into a monument of the heroes of the revolution. And the monument itself, if you look at it, and I look at it with the art historian's eyes, it's a mix of Art Deco and Mexican social realism, and it's superimposed over an existing neoclassical cupola structure, and there's 4 sculptures at either corner. The sculptures stand for independence, reform laws, agrarian law, and labor law. And the sculpture was assisted by Francisco Zuniga, who was a famous artist in his older years. Now, there's a museum underneath it all. And this subterranean museum is our introduction to our guest today, really. In my opinion, UCSB professor Veronica Castillo Munoz recently collaborated on a binational exhibit of Pancho Villa at this museum. Now, here's the irony. Pancho Villa must have been thrilled because he was there. You see, he is buried under the monument, which also serves as a mausoleum for the fallen heroes of the revolution, such as Pancho Villa, Francisco Madero, Plutarco Calles, Venustiano Carranza, many other heroes of the revolution. and I want to talk a little bit about the revolution and the women that participated. And in the backdrop of this, just really quick, and then we're going to talk a little bit about what we want to talk about today, which is Veronica's work. So we have just a quick timeline. So we put this in context. We have Mexican independence in 1822. We have Portofino Diaz period, which is 1876 to 1911, where we have the flowering of European everything, European art style, architecture, taste, talent, etc. 1910, we have the election of Francisco Madero. That's a disputed election. Now he loses the support of the famous Zapata to the south, who is working towards land reform, and 1913, Madero is assassinated. Now, in 1914, World War I is about to erupt, and Huerta resigns and flees, and victorious Pancho Villa, his forces re-enter Mexico City. Zapata meets with Pancho Villa, and both men had armies. They refused to meet with President Carranza. And by 1917, we have a new constitution and the restitution of land to peasants. That sounds easy, but it was hard and it was deadly. And I was reading in Veronica's article that she sent me that there were so many widows, 3 times as many widows as in previous years. And that's not counting all the casualties of husbands and other women too. And we want to talk a little bit about this with Veronica. And I should tell you that this lecture, if today interests you, the lecture coming up is April 24th. And it's at the Al Hikama Theater from 5:30 to 7. And you can meet Veronica and you talk about this period, and women's role in this period. And sorry for that lengthy introduction, Veronica, but I thought I'd just put it in context. First of all, I want to know what was a family in 1914? So when we start this all, the revolution is starting just so coincidentally, the beginning of World War I. What is a family? What does a family look like? Because when I think about it, I think about how in 1914, my grandparents came over from Germany in 1918. And the family, one of them was an orphan and grew up with my grandmother, grew up with her grandmother, and her family was just 2 people. My grandfather was one of 14 children, plus grandparents. So his family was 20 plus people, his core family. And I want you to tell me what a family was like in Mexico in 1914.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm happy to talk about my research, especially the impact, how women impacted the revolution, but also how the revolution impacted women. And your question about, what was a family in Mexico, or how did it look like in 1914? I want to step back a little bit to talk about the Mexican Revolution in a global context, because the Mexican Revolution is known as one of the most sweeping revolutions in Latin America and in modern history in the 20th century. Right? So it predates the Chinese Revolution in 1911, but also the Russian Revolution, right, in 1917. Now, the difference between these revolutions, the Chinese Revolution and the Russian Revolution, is that the Mexican Revolution, the violent aspect of the revolution lasted almost a decade, right, between 1910 and 1920. And families by 1914, there is the thick of the revolution, this is the most violent year, actually, of the revolution, when more people die. And families are separated sometimes by war. There are many women that fights in the revolution. So there are also many single women and heads of households. And it's also interesting to note, right, how historians in general have looked at the Mexican Revolution. And in general, they asked the emphasis have been in, institutions, the theater of war, Pancho Villa, as you mentioned, right? That has been, in general, the main focus of the Mexican Revolution. But women's, especially women that study gender in the Mexican Revolution in Latin America and in Mexico, really have zero end to what was the impact of the Mexican Revolution on women and also in family. And Elena Poniatowska mentions, and she's a famous writer in Mexico City, that without the women, there is no Mexican Revolution. Right? So by 1914, you see the mobilization of women during war. And especially during 1914, this is when we see in the north part of Mexico, where you see the most violent aspects of the Mexican Revolution. Here you see how Pancho Villa, for instance, introduces something that it doesn't happen in central Mexico, for instance, right? When we think about Pancho Villa and another revolutionary hero, Emiliano Zapata. Emiliano Zapata stays within central Mexico. He doesn't travel. And why is it that the Emiliano Zapata stays within central Mexico, especially just within the boundaries of Morelos? It's because he only mobilizes men, right? So they go to war, they come back. The difference in the north is that as the revolution rages in northern Mexico, Pancho Villa introduces basically the mobility of soldiers. And the mobility of soldiers only happens because the trains, right, that he uses the railroad, but he also brings the soldiers' families within the railroads, right? So without the women, there is no mobility, right? We have a really clear example in central Mexico with Zapata. Now, there are consequences, right, with the mobility of war. And this is when you see more violence, right? But also the destruction of the family unit, right? In northern Mexico, especially. And so families look very different.
I want to interrupt you, Veronica.
Sure.
I've got a question for you.
Mhm.
When we get back from the break, I want to know more about, okay, so the entire family, Pancho Villa is moving the entire families of the soldiers, and they're using the railways, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just wondering why. I was reading quite a bit yesterday, even though, it takes more than 4 or 5 hours to learn about this, but this is news to me that the family was so core in the battlefront technique. This is, the number of articles that I read, the entries in various history books yesterday, preparing for this, it wasn't mentioned. In
That's
fact,
correct.
there was only one mention of Pancho's first wife,
Mhm.
who you write about, in only one other article, who really was so instrumental to his formative years. It surprises me, this sin of omission, you see, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit when we get back from the break. Hey, Richard, let's go to a quick break. I'm just reintroducing Professor Veronica Castillo Munoz and her talk. As you can hear, how interesting it's going to be, April 24th at the Alan Kama Theater, a collaboration between the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation and UCSB History Associates. And this lecture is free. And how interesting. Don't turn that down. Back in a minute with Veronica.
Okay, you are clear.
Great.
hear the music, Richard? Did you get my music, Richard?
No, I can't say as I did, but I will look.
Oh, yeah,
I'll check
it's
my
there.
email again.
It's in your email, and I texted you this morning to check your email. But anyway, yeah, it's there.
All right, I will look for it. I'll go look for it now.
Okay. I think because okay, so
All right, it just came through, so I'll have some up here for the next break.
do you pronounce it Luz Caravia?
Yes.
Say, okay,
Luz
Luz
Caravia.
Caravia. I mean, what a strong woman. I mean, did you meet her in person for your article, for your chapter?
No, she had passed away
Yeah.
before I was in high school. But I read all her stories and interviews and newspaper articles, and I did
Yeah.
research in Mexico and the United States to capture, like all her live experiences.
I was looking, trying to find all the photos, because the photos of her and photos of her adopted children and Pancho, and I was trying to see what she looked like in the early years, and very interesting, so solid looking, and a question for you. Can visitors still tour Pancho and Luz's villa in Chihuahua?
Yes, it has become a museum now. I think it's like it's a government museum, like a government-run museum now. Yes.
I saw that and I thought, wouldn't that be interesting? What would Pancho think of that? But I know Luz wanted the government to have it, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yeah. And the object that you were dealing with at the museum in
Okay,
Mexico
we are coming
City.
back in
Okay.
3, 2, 1. You are live.
Welcome back. It's Elizabeth Stewart. I have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Veronica Castillo Munoz, associate professor, and she's working right now. Her focus is on the female story of the Mexican Revolution, which you have to know the Mexican Revolution was a sweeping panoply of brutal battles, criminal adventure, treacherous savagery. And on top of it all, it was at the beginning of this period where the media would sweep down on such events. The Mutual Film Corporation, for example, paid General Pancho Villa 20% of all ticket sales to become Hollywood's first revolutionary star. They'd bring film cameras down to film these bloody battles. And him commanding the troops just for the newsreels. Now, this was a revolution that preceded, as Professor was saying, the Chinese and the Russian Revolution, and opened a chapter that was hugely, war everywhere, 1914, war and revolution, and very interesting. We were talking right before the break about the importance of the family to General Pancho Villa and how he initiated a battle plan of bringing the entire family with the soldier through the train routes so that the army would be mobilized and mobile. And I said to Professor that, you know, even though this was skimming the top of the iceberg by trying to research for this talk today, I didn't read about that. I read everything about Pancho and how sensational his life was. I mean, we can talk a little bit about, you know, Pancho Villa himself and why he's, what was the quote here, Professor? Hated by thousands and loved by millions. And he was born in 1878. He was called the Centaur of the North. And he, you know, financed the Army of the North by stealing cattle herds and selling beef and trading in the U.S. for guns and ammo. He issued his own money. The Dorados would attack, firing accurately, coming at their foe at full gallop from charging horses. And they learned this technique from fighting the Comanches and Apaches a generation earlier. In 1913, Pancho Villa ran a revolutionary force of 3,000 Division del Norte troops against the federal troops, the cavalry charges, the night attacks. And then we can talk about some of the famous battles that he was in. Notorious, what would you say, Lothario, 25 wives, 25 children. I mean, you've got this backdrop here with this person of huge note, and nowhere did I see anything having to do with his technique of the family unit. Why, Veronica, why?
Yes. So, you know, basically, as yes, when you do your research, right, it's very difficult to find more about the role of women in the Mexican Revolution. But, you know, more female historians, especially feminist historians, are looking at the revolution from the lens, through the lens of gender and also women's experiences, right? Because then we have a different story, right? You can't have a Mexican Revolution without the women. And when we think about Pancho Villa, right, he's a very controversial figure, right? He is at one point, so you know, everybody admires him. That it has the admiration at some point in the United States. And that's another aspect, right? After 1916, when he attacks Columbus, New Mexico, right? He's demonized, and he is someone that is very dangerous to, you know, the United States feels the need to enter Mexico in 1916 and intervene and look for Pancho Villa, right? Then he becomes a danger to the United States.
Yeah.
He is a very controversial figure, but that's only part of the story, right? And so you have overwhelmingly, when looking at the literature and the history of the Mexican Revolution, the focus is in the heroes and the controversial heroes as well, like Pancho Villa and others, Emiliano Zapata, Calles, et cetera, right? But when one missing piece is, what was the role of women, right? And how did women change the revolution, right? And the practice of the mobility of the soldiers from Pancho Villa, it was very effective, right? He didn't just stay in Chihuahua or in Sonora, right, in northern Mexico, like other fighters of the revolution, like Zapata, who only stayed in the area of Morelos and Central Mexico, right? Because he didn't, his army was only of men. Women stay back at the house or at home. So that is the big difference. But another thing that I also want to point out is that the federal military also, right, when they move soldiers, they also have women and their families mobilizing. And that's how they move also to counterattack in northern Mexico. So when we have, for instance, the coup that in 1913, when Victoriano Huerta kills the Mexican president, the Mexican elected president, Francisco I. Madero, and his vice president. This is when you see that the most violent aspect of the Mexican Revolution is in the northern Mexico, right? It's in Chihuahua with Pancho Villa, Carranza in Sonora, and Durango. So this is what you see, the most violent aspects of the Mexican Revolution. And that's where my work comes in. I want to bring more attention to the aspects of the violence of the Mexican Revolution, but also what was the impact on women, right? What was the role of women during the Mexican Revolution and family as well, right? So if one part is the mobility of women, that the women they're not just companions, right? Because there is another aspect that, especially in official Mexican history, then there is the women as companions of soldiers. And there are so many images of women, right? If you go through Google, if you Google the Mexican Revolution and women, the description is of women as companions. And it's important to really look into, were women just companions, right? Because when you look into the roles of women, right? I write about Luz Villa. And Luz Villa, this is a prime example of how women experience the revolution, right? Because you have these revolutionary heroes that takes all the attention. But if you look at Luz Villa's life, right? She was a smuggler. She also was a nurse, right? She became the spokesperson of Pancho Villa in the United States. So if you look at all the newspapers about Pancho Villa, especially in the New York Times and the LA Times, there are many interviews when Luz Villa comes to the United States, and the newspapers, there are many reports about Luz Villa and how she reports about what is going on in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. And so this is the aspect of my research that I want to highlight, the aspects of women's experiences.
So just, dear listener, just a little bit of a side note. Luz Villa was the first wife of Pancho Villa. And actually, I was thinking about Veronica, how she fought for her rights as the first of 25 wives, and actually went to battle in a system, in a legal system, where even with the new Constitution in 1917, women did not vote. So she goes to battle, and she actually wins the estate, Pancho and Luz's villa in Chihuahua, and she wins the rights to actually have that estate. And her life, just so you know, dear listener, her life bereft of the money. She has the house, which has 50 rooms, and it's a big house. What does she do with it? She turns it into a museum of the revolution and charges people to experience what she thought of the revolution and her experiences and the artifacts there. And I asked Professor if this mansion was still around in Chihuahua, can visitors still visit the mansion? And yes, she kept it. She died in 90-something years. She kept tours going.
I think she was 89 when she passed away, yes.
Yeah, kept tours going at the house. Just a dumb question here, Veronica. Pancho Villa's grave in Cementerio Municipal in Parral. There's a mystery behind the grave. Apparently, the body was exhumed and the head was removed. And 3 years later, the government ordered Pancho Villa's body moved to Mexico City, to the museum we introduced the show, Museum of the Revolutionary, to the tomb of the illustrious men there. But the tombstone in Parral is still there with what? What's behind the tombstone?
Basically, there are many controversies and also myths about Pancho Villa. And so there are stories and tales about Pancho Villa, and also, excuse me, what happened to his body. So there are many tales and stories that are intertwined with, stories and what people remembers. So this is how Pancho Villa becomes this myth, right? Because about his body, if he's still alive. So there are many myths about Pancho Villa. They're still difficult. Like historians are still trying to intertwine.
So the idea is that Pancho is a myth, but he's also a folk hero, and he's also highly despised in the U.S. at one point, where he's attacking Columbus, New Mexico in 1916. And he's actually, this is an interesting detail I had no idea, Veronica, but Pancho Villa is the second foreign military agent to attack the United States since the War of 1812. He's the second entity to attack the states since the War of 1812. I mean, just a remarkable, as you say, myth, legend, hero. He was mentioning his first wife, Luz Villa. And Luz, her story is so interesting because she tells the story of the revolution from the wife's perspective, from the first wife's perspective. And she is a soldier herself in a way. She's a female fighter. She's a nurse. She's a smuggler. And she has experienced the revolution as Professor Veronica writes. She experiences the war and aging in a way that is so unique from the men that fought in the revolution. Aging, that kind of surprised me. Tell me more about that, Veronica.
Yes, so Luz Villa has a very interesting story because unlike the other, that many of the heroes, male heroes of the revolution, Luz Villa had a very long life. And because she had a museum and she gave personal tours about the museum, you can basically learn about the Mexican Revolution from her perspective, right? Perspective of women. So she does, people come to the museum to learn more about Pancho Villa. But what you also learn is about how Luz Villa talks about the role of women in the revolution, right? And this is something that it hasn't been paid much attention, right? What are the memories of women? How do women remember the revolution, right? Because the revolution in general, I mean, as I mentioned, it's a sweeping revolution, right? And for women, it also changes many things for women in Mexico, right? Because before women usually don't travel. The mobility of women is actually very, it keeps to the place where they were born. And usually, they will not travel as much. When the revolution happens, this is when you see the large mobility of women and families. From, especially if we think about Pancho Villa and the army, right? They are leaving Chihuahua to go to central Mexico, to southern Mexico, right? To different places in Mexico. Women will have never been allowed to leave, right? Especially single women. So it's not just women and families, like it's not just a family moving up and down in the train. You also find single women. You also find women who cross-dress as men, right, to fight in the revolution. There are many stories like that about women cross-dressing and fighting and passing, quote unquote, as men, right, and fighting in the Mexican Revolution. And to really have a better understanding of the Mexican Revolution is very important, not to leave that half of the very important aspect, in my perspective, right, of women's experiences. This provides us with a better understanding of the Mexican Revolution. But also, what happens when women and families are fleeing the violence, right? And that is also another aspect of my research. What happens with women and families who decide that they no longer want to fight in the revolution and they're fleeing the violence, they're leaving to the United States. And for women living in northern Mexico, like Chihuahua, like Sonora, right, in the border, which is the border states between Mexico and the United States, I'm also interested to know more about what happens, right? What happens to women who comes to the United States as exiles, right? Seeking refuge in the United States. So that's basically part of a talk that I'll be giving on Wednesday about the
see.
experiences of women.
So I want to mention also, interestingly enough, that I was looking at a couple of pieces of this research from the male perspective, written by males, who suggest that the women are not actually enthused to fight for the revolution. They're just following their husbands because that's what women do, because they're loyal. And I thought, wait a minute, something's wrong with that picture, because these are women that are, as you say, the other side of the coin, Veronica. They're fleeing the violence without the men. They're saying, okay, forget it, we're going, and I'm bringing the kids, and they're leaving in droves. The biggest migration, one of the biggest in history, coming to the United States. So you've got some, and then interestingly enough, the President Carranza in 1916. He says to the Department of War and the Navy, I want all the ranks of the women who fought in the revolution to be deleted from the records. So no women were involved in any of those records, and no women actually received pensions for fighting in the revolution. And here we have the Constitution in 1917 being written with very little recognition or resonance as far as even giving female Mexican women the vote. They don't get the vote till 1958. It's craziness, crazy. So we get back from the break. I want to talk a little bit about that. And I want to ask, here we have this patriarchal society, leaders of such incredible mythic machismo. I want to know what men thought of women who were fighting alongside of them as soldiers, as smugglers, as nurses. What did men think of women? I want to know that when we get back from the break. Hey, Richard, let's go to quick break. And here again, I'm super excited to tell you guys, April 24th at the Alhambra Theater, which is the 200 block, I think, of East Cannon, Perdido. You're going to be treated to a lecture by Veronica Castillo-Muñez on this very topic. And the lecture is given by the Santa Barbara Trust for Historic Preservation and UCSB History Associates. So that is a free lecture. Let's go to a quick break. When we get back from the break, I want to know what men thought of the female counterparts in the Mexican Revolution. Don't turn that down.
All right, you're clear.
As a matter of fact, it was interesting. One of the articles, I think it was for True West magazine, I was reading an article on the Pancho Villa and the Revolution, and it went on and on about the various women that he married and bedded and all this sort of thing, and mentioned Luz once in the entire article, and then said that and also got it wrong and said that she was the last wife. And I don't know if you caught that particular blunder, but I saw it a number of times trying to prepare for this, Veronica, and that he actually, what was more sensational than her, for I don't know how many years, 60 years, telling the story of Pancho Villa at her own museum. What was more interesting than that, because he didn't mention that, what was more interesting was he married twice, 2 times a year from 1910 to 1923. I wrote that down because I thought, how insignificant is that? You know?
Well, there's actually myths about how many, it's really, we don't know, but in record that there are actually 3 marriages that, 3 women are the ones fighting for the state. So in record, we have about 3. And then the rest is also part of a myth that, he married twice. So it's about part of, Pancho Villa's myth, right?
Yes, yes. But this article said he was a legend. He officially married, officially married 25 times, had 25 children,
Yeah.
and he married 2 times a year in the years 1910, 11,
Right.
12, all the way to 1923 that he married twice a year. So he was, getting rid of one at, let's say, the 6 months mark or something like this, and then
Yeah.
marrying another. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. But when I actually look at the records in Mexico City about
Yeah.
who actually went after the state of Pancho Villa, there were 3 women. The rest is in local towns, in local villages. So it's very difficult to really point out how many times he got married. But the ones that I was able to trace, there were 3 that went after the state of Pancho Villa. Yeah. That they claim rights to the Pancho Villa's state, the ranchos, the hacienda. And so it's very, he's a very controversial figure.
Tell me about this. So he died in 1923, and he
Mhm.
left Luz a widow with an orphanage on the estate where she had 50 children. Is that correct?
No, she basically adopted children. So part of the legacy of women who fought in the revolution, and the stories about women who fought in the revolution is that they will say, if I die, can you take care of my child? And Luz Villa was also part of that she took in children of women who died during the revolution, right?
So
They died
when
at birth, some of them. So that is kind of also part of a legacy of when we think about women who fought in the revolution. Like there were hard conversations about who will take care of the children if they die. Mhm.
Hey, Richard, are we on the air?
Not yet. This is your last break, but you're not on the air yet. I'll let you know.
Okay, so another question. So the, I'm reading that when Pancho died, there was an orphanage on the estate,
Right. Mhm.
and she had 50 kids in that orphanage.
Correct. Yes.
She's got no money. I mean, what does she do with the 50 kids?
She continued running the orphanage, and that's why she converted a museum into, like her stay into a museum for income. And she will rent the rooms to low-income families that, stay there for years and years.
Okay, here we go. In 3, 2, 1, you're live.
Welcome back. I am speaking. It's a great pleasure, and I'm speaking with Veronica Castillo Munoz. And the reason is because I was so intrigued by this upcoming lecture. She's actually going to talk to us about the role of women, not the role, but the contributions, the incredibly important role, contribution-wise, of women during the Mexican Revolution, which led to the deaths of over 1 million people and the mass migration of about 1 million refugees from rural Mexico to the United States. Huge event at the beginning of the 20th century, not often talked about, not often looked at. And, this is happening before the Chinese and the Russian revolutions, which basically are, everybody knows a lot about those revolutions indeed, but we don't know much about Mexican Revolution, and we don't know much about the role of women. And I asked Professor, so here you have this patriarchal society, Mexico in the early 20th century, You've got the leaders who are known and celebrated and mythologized, and Hollywood comes and films them. They're on horseback, they're charging, they're macho, they're marrying, they're lovers, they're dancing in the evenings with their with females that are in their camps, and then they're getting up and fighting, and they're just incredible macho. I can't think of anything more macho. And yet there's the women that they're side by side as female fighters, nurses, and smugglers during the revolution. But what did the men think of the women?
Yeah, so, and it's very interesting. Thank you for your question. It's also very interesting to, I've been reading, part of this research also looks at how the United States made this perception of the macho Mexican, right? And the revolution plays a role in terms of looking at these perceptions of Mexican people, women and men as well. Right? And so for the United States, especially newspapers, if you look at how the United States cover the Mexican Revolution, and also men, right? This perception of the macho, the bloodthirsty Mexican, this negative perspectives actually about Mexican people pretty much comes during the revolution. It pretty much increases during the Mexican Revolution, right? There are some negative ideas about it, but during the Mexican Revolution, you see how newspapers in the United States covers the Mexican Revolution and begins to describe men as the macho, bloodthirsty, violent Mexican that to this day, right, in the politics of the United States comes around about the bad Mexicans, quote unquote, right? So as a historian, I'm interested to see where did this come from, right? And it comes from this period of the Mexican Revolution. When we think about the women, right, and how women had such a crucial role in the Mexican Revolution, the realization of many of these leaders is that we need women. Women are central to our fight in the Mexican Revolution, right? Quickly, Pancho Villa and other revolutionaries in the North learned that in order for them to be more wild, right, to go to Southern Mexico, they needed women in their family, like especially the families of soldiers to come, right? But as the revolution progresses, we begin to see also the professionalization of nurses, right? You have women, single women, coming in the trains, right, as nurses. And increasingly, they are asking the revolutionaries to, provide funding for schools that will train women as nurses. And so we see the professionalization of nurses, but also the women as journalists that write about the revolution. That is also very important. So we cannot lump together women as just the companions of the men, right, going along the trains, because there is more to the story. And that's where, that's basically part of my research, right? Looking at women not just as the companions, but as the fighters, as the writers of the revolution, as the nurses, right? But also the political life, because women during the revolution now are involved in political life during the Mexican Revolution. The 1917 Constitution, although, right, women do not get the right to vote until 1953, you do have many debates about women's rights. And those debates actually make it into the Constitution, which is the right to divorce, right? In other Latin American countries, divorce is not legal until later in the mid-20th century. That was not the case in Mexico, and it's because of the involvement of women. We have the right to divorce into the Constitution of the Mexican Constitution of 1917 because women, right, lobby for the right to get divorced in 1917. So there's some, it is very important to understand the revolution, but also how women, right, what was the role of women in the Mexican Revolution, to have a clear idea of the impact of the Mexican Revolution, but not just in Mexico, but also in the United States, right? Because most of these battles, the most significant and violent battles happen at the US-Mexico border.
So at the most significant battles happen at the border, and I thought it was very interesting the way you described some of the media reports that were contemporary to the revolution, Mexican Revolution. The media is coming down on the side of, as you say, this the sensationalism of the machismo of these leaders, and this carries through. I mean, even today. I'm thinking of Mel Brooks's movie Blazing Saddles, is it? Where he's interviewing people that are going to fight for in the old American West. And, there's it goes back into historical time. There's a bunch of Nazi soldiers. There's a bunch of Mexican revolutionaries, with the bullets strapped across the chest. And the famous line, badges, we don't need no stinking badges. And they're the Mexican revolutionaries, portrayed that way in the 70s and the 80s, 1970s, 1980s, a carryover from the Mexican Revolution, and the coverage in the media. And we were mentioning that, here's the filmmakers and reporters flocking to the battle scenes to record Pancho Villa and some of the other heroes of the revolution, and the photography that comes out of that period, photojournalism of that period, is incredible. Veronica, there's a number of shots where there's the revolutionaries on these beautiful horses, fully decked out with all of the bullets and the guns and huge weaponry that they're carrying on their backs, for example, and they're at full speed charging ahead, and the shot is up, like the perspective is up, like this is a huge mountain of a man on this huge horse. Incredible. I look at art all day long, and I think even the perspective of the angle of the shot is telling you something.
Absolutely. Right. You see Hollywood coming to the border, right? And if there are some images that I saw when I went to the museum of El Paso, where you see people in El Paso basically across, right across from the Rio Grande, or the Rio Grande, right? Just basically will come on Sundays. And you will see so many people looking across the Rio Grande where the battles will take place. And then the movie theaters actually catch on very early that they could actually make money. So they will have, seatings, and there's a book that is very interesting that talks about what happens in El Paso. It's called Ringside to the Revolution, that talks about all the changes that happened because the Hollywood films are coming to El Paso and crossing onto Ciudad Juarez to film the Mexican Revolution. And this is where Pancho Villa also becomes this myth, right?
I want to give one more shout out. The lecture, if you're interested in this hour, has piqued your interest. April 24th at the Alhambra Theater, and Veronica Castillo Munoz will tell us more about women and the role of women in the Mexican Revolution. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a great time.
Great time for me too. I loved it. Thank you. Bye, Rick. Bye, Richard. Bye, Veronica.
Bye-bye.
Okay, you are clear.
Thanks, Richard.
You're welcome.